The tank battle began in Kursk. On one side, the Ukrainians attacked. On the other, the Russian tank tried to protect its troops. The blazing cannons dispersed some of the icy winter wind. Inside the armored vehicles, the crews adjusted their sights, cursing at every explosion that failed to hit the enemy. The fighting stretched through the neighboring forests. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian special forces were carrying out a crucial mission. They saw chaos traps were set, and they patiently waited for their prey to approach. 6 months have passed since Kyiv's troops entered Kursk. The battle was now approaching one of its final chapters. The year was coming to an end, and many said that the Ukrainian operation in Kursk was also heading toward a conclusion. The lost territories forced the command in Kyiv to adopt different tactics to stop the Russian advance, at least so that part of their troops could withdraw. This only increased the intensity of the fighting. The end of 2024 and the beginning of 2025 were proving to be even more tense in the war. The United States' idea of a ceasefire didn't seem ready to move forward, especially with messy negotiations which sometimes left Ukraine itself and even its main allies out of the talks. The drone war continued. Weapons flew between the countries. Some of the Ukrainian attacks reached Tatarstan by the end of 2024. Panic filled the hearts of the Russians, who ran to save themselves from the explosions at the oil refinery and in the Ala-Volga Special Economic Zone. The latter was where the Russians produced some of the Shahid drones, which struck Ukrainian cities outside the front so many times. The attack caused a loss of $16 million to the Russians. Moscow continued its attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure, mainly targeting the energy sector. Hundreds of drones and missiles flew in December 2024. According to the Ukrainians, Moscow's goal was to terrorize the population and increase the hardships for civilians during the winter. It reported that in one of the attacks, 10 people died and 24 were injured, including 2 children hit by bomb fragments. Another attack ended with 3 dead when a Russian drone hit Ukrainians. They made many accusations against the Russians in Kherson. In one of them, they said that Moscow soldiers were training their drone operators against civilians. Some images showed the desperation of people as the grenades fell. The Ukrainians continued to send their drones against Russia, even hitting a training center of the Akhmat Special Forces in Chechnya. The Russians were forced to shoot down many of these drones. The reaction to the attacks ended up causing accidents. When an aircraft was detected in the skies, the Panzer defense system acted quickly. The computers locked onto the target. The missiles flew in pursuit of the supposed drone. The projectiles exploded near the aircraft. Unfortunately, it was a civilian plane from Azerbaijan Airlines heading to Chechnya. Fragments pierced the fuselage and injured passengers. The pilot used all his skill to fly and make an emergency landing in Kazakhstan with an impact that killed 38 people. The crew's efforts during the tragedy made it possible to save another 29. Once again, war has harmed many people who have nothing to do with the conflict. The Ukrainians also targeted one of their main enemies in the Battle of Kursk, the 810th Naval Brigade. A RAMARS attack destroyed one of the command centers, killing 18 soldiers. Among them were Lieutenant Colonels Valery Tarishenko, Chief of Communications, and Pavel Malitevsky, commander of the engineer battalion.
The Russians claimed that the shelling also killed 4 civilians.
Kursk was still filled with fire on the edges of Ukraine. Kyiv tried to contain the pressure. Its special forces troops continued to obey orders to create chaos among the enemies. The soldiers stepped carefully on the dry leaves that covered the ground. There was still a trace of green in the trees, resisting the cold. Those men were experienced soldiers. They went through long training for infiltration into enemy territory. Some survived years of war, a great feat in a conflict like that. When the violence started, it was quick. That's how the war fed on blood, breaking the sense of tranquility with projectiles tearing through flesh.
The grenade exploded next to one of the soldiers.
He was lucky not to be hit by deadly fragments. There were only trees to take cover behind. During the advance, the shells were ejected from the rifle's chamber, sending out the deadly projectiles that flew.
The rifles pressed the enemies.
The Ukrainians advanced more slowly now, hiding wherever they could. Some mounds of earth used to make the Russian trench served as protection. The Moscow infantry soldiers were inside those holes. They were less trained compared to those elite troops. Their bodies remained on the ground. The operators sent by Kyiv went to take the other positions. The Kilo reconnaissance team was made up of foreigners within the armed forces and was associated with the main intelligence director of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. They were attacked by Russian artillery during the advance. They ran to escape the explosions. The bombs nearly hit them, shattering trees in the field. They kept up the pressure, held their position even under attack, providing support to the squad advancing on another flank. Their experience as former light SEALs or former soldiers of the Foreign Legion gave them the cold blood to shoot while bombs exploded around them. They pulled back as soon as command informed them that the mission was accomplished. Euphoric shouts, fueled by the adrenaline of war, filled the tree line. The retreat was still full of dangers. The Russians kept drone teams watching. The Ukrainians prepared the kamikazes for flight. The launch was done by catapult, which avoided extra energy expenditure during takeoff. While they were preparing, the surveillance drone confirmed the coordinates. The Ukrainians were getting into the vehicle. When the kamikaze came down on them, the vehicle was completely destroyed. A few soldiers were left as witnesses to how dangerous an exfiltration could be. The Russians relied on several systems to attack the Ukrainians from a distance in their attempt to drive them out of Kursk. They often used tanks as artillery pieces. Their cannons could hit targets at great distances. Self-propelled artillery like the 2S-1 Gvozdika was also widely used. The operational range of 500 km allowed them to be positioned in various parts of Kursk. Their 20 kg shells were loaded into the cannon and flew along with the cold winds until the 3 kg of explosives unleashed their violence against the Ukrainians. Kiev's special forces tried to stop the advance of the armored vehicles and Russian columns that were driving the Ukrainians out of Kursk. The soldiers spread mines along the routes used by the Russians. The explosions disrupted the movement of Moscow's troops. Hidden within the tree lines, the special forces operators unleashed their storm against the Russians. Unprepared, armored vehicles turned into smoke. The anti-tank projectiles hit some of those vehicles one after another until they stopped near the trees. The Ukrainians persisted in launching explosives, stealthily advancing toward the paralyzed enemies. Their shots hunted down the fleeing adversaries across the field of generations. They fired until the flames began to feed on the Russian metal. They approached to confirm the success of the ambush, took their trophies, and withdrew before the Russian drones and artillery could retaliate. The Ukrainian armored vehicles also moved in to attack. In Kursk, a T-64BV, sent by Kyiv, roamed among the ruins of war inside Russia. The tracks rolled through streets surrounded by destroyed houses. Russian soldiers washed through the remains of the windows, relying on the support of their comrades, since they didn't have anti-tank weapons to defend themselves. The T-64BV was a modernized version of the Soviet T-64 armored vehicle, originally developed in the late 1960s and put into service in 1967. The BV variant was introduced in the 1980s with significant improvements in protection and combat capability. It was one of the most iconic armored vehicles of the Cold War and was now fighting inside Russia. AT from Moscow appeared to defend its comrades hidden in the ruins. The duel between the tanks began immediately. Explosions shook the ground. The crews on both sides struggled to steady their aim. The Russians thought it wise to move after the blast got too close. They launched a smoke screen. The white mist mixed with the fire that hit directly. The T-80 survived, but decided to retreat for good. It left the infantry behind, under the crossfire of the Ukrainian T-64. The ruins, where minutes earlier the drones had marked targets, exploded into smoldering debris. Inside those shattered houses, hope turned to dust. The tank gave no respite. For more than an hour, its tracks dragged through the village, crushing houses, bones, and any possible refuge. The shots pulverized bricks and concrete posts, creating an opening up to 2 meters in diameter in what was still standing, and knocking down almost everything in the process. The attack was important to buy time. Other tanks tried to do the same. One of them was the Leopard 2, sent by the Germans in support of the Ukrainians. This version entered service in 1979. The 2A4 variant, which was among those used by the forces of Kyiv, only entered service a year later. The Leopards were known for their accuracy. The stability of the firing system allowed them to hit targets precisely, even while moving. The Leopard moved back and forth to avoid becoming an easy target for Russian artillery. Its cannon destroyed the enemy hideouts. The high explosive shells scattered lethal fragments, making the Russians feel their power within a 50-meter radius. Of course, the great predator of tanks was present. The propellers cut through the cold winter wind. The lifeless eyes of that airborne plague locked onto the massive target, crushing the snow. Ukasa. The drone exploded against the tank's engine. The predators used to appear in packs to hunt. Another came to check if the prey had succumbed to the first. Historian used the tank's roots. The last of the drones observed the lifeless carcass. Now it was time to feed on the crew. A destroyed tank was not the end of a battle. The Leopard's crew rushed out. They knew other drones were about to arrive. They ran to join the troops hiding in the nearest town. At that point, the Ukrainians had lost more than half of the territory they had gained in Kursk. The new year was about to begin, and with it, the Russians would only intensify the hunt against the invading troops. The drones searched for the crew of the Leopard and the men it would be protecting. It filmed each of the future victims of the swarm of electronic pests that began to drop explosives. The soldiers were hunted down in every hiding place they found on the frozen ground. The number of wounded and dead kept increasing. In that position, it became impossible to maintain the defense. The explosions covered the entire village. Until a tank approached. The drones devoured it as if it were a lost lamb in the fields.
Chaos on one side, chaos on the other.
The operators of the 8th Special Purpose Regiment made their entrance into a Russian position. They managed to surprise the enemies, getting close to the trenches where they were hiding without having to shoot. Some of them began to surrender, handing over all their combat equipment. The drones were sent up to check where the others were. The rifles were ready to greet the Russians with fire. Until the that one. It was a quick fight, which ended with many corpses lying among the trees. The Ukrainians searched for information from the bodies of the fallen Russians. The surrendered ones were searched to prevent hidden weapons and to have their wounds treated. The Russians sent more armored vehicles in another assault against the Ukrainian positions as early as January. By early 2025, they had conquered the territory in Makhnovka and Malaya Loknya. The advance was steady toward Lebedevka. Halfway there, they encountered the 47th Mechanized Brigade of Ukraine. A column exploded, flipping the vehicles and breaking the soldiers' bones inside. Each vertebra of the metal column took its share of fire until the entire movement of the assault force came to a halt. The drone hunts against these attack columns turned much of the Russian equipment into scrap metal on the roads of Kursk. Any attack came at a very high cost at that time. Many of the soldiers didn't have the necessary experience to face that level of warfare. The intense destruction turned technology worth millions of dollars into pure scrap metal. The surviving soldiers sometimes seemed to give up on life when they heard the drone. One of them stood still, waiting for the grenade to drop. He was lucky that the explosive landed right in front of him. No shrapnel hit him. He still didn't have the strength or courage to move. He needed to take more steps in that cold hell. However, he simply couldn't move a single finger. That drone that buzzed above him was carrying another explosive. It dropped it to execute the Russian. The Russians insisted. A column with 3 vehicles advanced through the metal skeletons left by previous attacks. They moved cautiously across the field in a line. The first armored vehicle tested the ground, risking that fire would burst from the earth to devour the metal. They managed to cross the field without triggering any mines. They quickly disembarked the soldiers near the edge of the forest and began the withdrawal movement.
Then the first vehicle was swallowed by an explosion.
As if a seed of fire had sprouted in its belly. Black smoke completely enveloped the burning shell. The Russian Marines didn't even look back. Ignoring the destruction smoldering behind them, they entered the dense forest, hunting the Ukrainian ghosts they knew were lurking.
A reinforcement vehicle appeared in the rear, its engine roaring under the weight of the armor.
The transport moved forward, firing bursts from its cannon, each shot echoing like thunder among the trees. With the skies inexplicably empty of drones, the Russians grew more confident. Their momentum grew as more soldiers were poured on the front line, wave after wave, crashing against the Ukrainian defenses. The forest turned into hell. Explosions multiplied among the pine trees, sending shards of wood and metal in all directions.
Death had set its feast on that frozen ground, collecting souls that burned in the intense fire of combat.
Each extinguished life only fed its insatiable hunger even more.
Thus, Moscow was reconquered. It was a thorn in the Russians' plans.
50,000 soldiers were called to fight in the region, an unnecessary war effort at a time when the advance in Donetsk was so rapid.
The reward for the Ukrainians for this operation would still be much debated.
The fact was that the thorn stuck in Putin's pride had been bothering him for more than 6 months. He wanted it removed as violently as possible. Allies and police officers. Amr asks, did they die?